Hi, this is John Burek, Editor-in-Chief of Computer Shopper Magazine. Today we're going to talk a bit about motherboards. Buying a motherboard can be a bit intimidating. If you look at a spec sheet from a motherboard manufacturer, you'll find that there's a lot of technology that can be a bit esoteric and sometimes confusing. We're going to take a tour of two motherboards, an AMD model and an Intel model, to give you an idea of what you're looking at when you look at a motherboard spec sheet. The first thing to consider when you're buying a motherboard is the form factor of motherboard that your case supports. What I have here is a micro ATX motherboard. You'll notice, compared to the two ATX motherboards on the table here, that the micro ATX motherboard is smaller. Depending on the case you have, it may support micro ATX, ATX, or potentially another motherboard form factor. You want to make sure that whatever you buy matches what your case supports. Now let's take a look at these two ATX motherboards that we have here. Here we have an Intel motherboard made by ASUS. You'll notice here that there's a cover over this square, which is the CPU socket. In this particular board, it's what's known as an Intel LGA 775 socket. And when I take off the cover, you'll see why it has that name. This is a protective plate, this gray thing here. It protects the 775 little pins that you see underneath here. And what those pins do is make contact with the underside of a chip. This chip is a Core 2 quad processor, and it drops into the socket just like this. You want to make sure that the socket type matches the CPU type that you're looking to buy. On this AMD-based board, this is another ASUS board, you'll notice that the socket AM2 has holes in it as opposed to pins. That's the polar opposite of the Intel board. Here the chip itself has the pins on it, but installing it works similarly. You would lift the lever, drop the chip in, and push it back down to secure it. Apart from the physical fit of the CPU and the sockets, you should still check any motherboard spec sheet for a board you're looking at to make sure that it supports the specific speed and model of CPU that you're considering. Even though there's a physical match between the chip and the socket, doesn't necessarily mean that they'll work together. Apart from the CPU, you'll notice around the edge of the sockets in both of these boards there's a lot of copper. That's covering up what's known as the motherboard chipset. The motherboard chipset governs a lot of the basic functionality of the motherboard, and in most cases you could safely ignore the motherboard chipset type, because if the board has the functionality that you need or want, the chipset will follow. There's another major point of differentiation among motherboards, which are the expansion slots. The two blue slots that you see here are PCI Express X16 slots. These are typically used for graphics cards, although they can also be used for smaller PCI Express devices. The two smaller slots sandwiched in between here are PCI Express X1 slots. Those are used for low bandwidth cards, typically Ethernet adapters or drive controllers. The longer white slots that you see here are PCI slots, which are used for legacy devices, for instance TV tuners. The slot on the end here is also a PCI Express slot, an X16 type. The thing is, in this case, it differs from these two slots in that it doesn't support the full bandwidth that these two slots do. This one only supports what's called X1 or X4 bandwidth, which means even though you may put an X16 card in here, it won't operate as quickly as if you put it in one of these slots. Speaking of slots, there's another set of slots on a motherboard that are very important to consider when you're buying, the RAM or DIMM slots. If you take a look at this board, you'll notice that there are 4 slots, and they're color-coded. There's a set of black and a set of orange. If you install just 2 pieces of RAM, in this case DDR3 memory, which is the current fastest type of memory you can buy, you'll want to put them in the matching color-coded slots. Doing that will increase performance. This is a piece of DDR3 memory. This board supports up to 8 gigs of DDR3 memory, and in each bank you can put in up to 2 gigabytes. So you'll want to make sure that the type of memory that you own matches the type that the board supports, and that the capacity of the memory does not exceed the maximum capacity per slot. In addition to RAM, another important thing to consider are the types of ports that your particular motherboard has. If you look at this particular board, you'll notice that there are some standard things. There are USB ports. There's also a keyboard port, an SPDIF out port, that's a digital output. There's an Ethernet port, which is pretty standard, as well as a FireWire port. You'll also notice a newer type of port here below the 1394 port, which is eSATA, or External Serial ATA. These are typically used for connecting external storage. You'll also notice on the right here 6 round jacks. These are used with surround sound speakers, and they're powered by a chipset on the motherboard that handles audio. You don't need a separate sound card on this particular motherboard. You'll also want to check your spec sheet to make sure that drive connectors for the drives that you own are on the board. Here you'll notice a IDE port. This is used for connecting up to 2 older optical or hard drives, and a series of serial ATA ports. Those are used for connecting newer hard drives and optical drives. This board also has a floppy drive port. This would be used for connecting an internal floppy drive if you choose to continue to use one. This particular board, you'll notice, has a series of what are called headers along the far edge. These are used for connecting the cables that run from the case to the ports themselves on the case. On the left here, you'll notice that there's a FireWire header, as well as to its right, 2 USB headers. To the right of that, the white cluster of pins you see are used for connecting the various LEDs and switches on the case itself, such as the power switch or the hard drive activity switch. Finally, one of the things to look for are compatible power connectors on the motherboard. You'll notice on this particular board that there's a 24-pin jack, which is the main power feed from your power supply. You'll want to make sure that your power supply has the proper connector to interface with the motherboard. There's also a secondary power feed, as you'll notice over here. That's a either 4-pin or 8-pin connector, which your power supply may or may not have. Again, you'll want to look for compatibility or appropriate connector. Finally, scattered around the board, you'll notice some 3-pin or in some motherboards 4-pin fan connectors. These connectors are used for connecting either the CPU fan that would cover the chip in the main CPU socket, or for connecting chassis fans. For more buying advice, reviews, and product recommendations for PC building and PC components, go to computershopper.com/components.